All right, let's continue with where we left off on Friday. So we were talking about Bleeding Kansas, and we've talked about John Brown and Potawatomi and the murder of 5 pro-slavery settlers out there. And we talked about it basically being, on a small scale at least in Kansas, a civil war. And it continued this way until it kind of dissolved into a part of the bigger Civil War. But regardless, despite the fact that there was violence and fighting in Kansas, by the time we get to 1957, there are enough people in Kansas for Kansas to petition for statehood. Remember, the pro-slavery government, the legitimate government, was located at Shawnee Mission. And when it comes time to vote for a constitution, we have what we call the Compton Constitution, and this was strange the way it was set up. People weren't allowed to vote for this Constitution necessarily. They were allowed to vote for the Constitution with slavery or without slavery, not on the Constitution itself. The problem is that even if they voted for the Constitution with no slavery, there was another section of the Constitution that protected slave owners that were already in Kansas. So anti-slavery voters, even if they voted for a constitution with no slavery, slavery would still be allowed for those that already existed in Kansas. So as a result, no matter how they voted, slavery would continue in Kansas. As a result, anti-slavery settlers, free soilers, boycotted the election. The Constitution in 1857 was approved by Kansas voters. This is a political cartoon from the time, obviously from the pro or anti-slavery side of the equation, believing that with the Lecompton Constitution, slavery was being forced down the throats of the free soilers. Now, James Buchanan, certainly influenced and favorable to the South, supported the Lecompton Constitution. As you can imagine, Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, fought against it because he was very much in favor of popular sovereignty and wanted a fair vote for popular sovereignty, to his credit. Unfortunately for the presidential hopes of Stephen Douglas, this didn't serve him too well in his popularity in the South. So at this point, supporting or being against the Lecompton Constitution eliminated any chance that he would have support in the South for a possible presidency in the next election. The Senate approved Kansas as a free state in March of 1858. So the Senate approved it with the Lecompton Constitution. And you can understand that because the votes are much closer between pro and anti-slavery states in the Senate. The House, in a very close vote, and remember the House of Representatives is going to have greater representative from the northern part of the country, defeats the Lecompton vote, 120 to 112. And amazingly, a fight breaks out on the floor of the Senate. So not so much for decorum. Good quote here. There were some 50 middle-aged and elderly gentlemen pitching into each other like so many Tipperary savages. The Tipperary probably referring to Tippecanoe. Most of them incapable, from want of wind and muscle, of doing each other serious harm. But nonetheless, imagine fisticuffs breaking out on the floor of the Senate. Another quote, Alexander Stephens, "If any weapons had been on hand, it probably would have been a bloody one. All things here are tending my mind to the conclusion that the Union cannot and will not last long." So certainly a foreshadowing for what will happen in the not too distant future. With the Lecompton Constitution not being accepted by Congress, we have to have some kind of compromise between pro and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. So it was agreed that they would put the entire Constitution to an up or down vote. If the Constitution is rejected, Kansas would remain a territory at this stage and at some point later could petition for statehood again. And when this election on more level ground is offered, the anti-slavery voters do decide to vote, and the Constitution is soundly rejected. So as a result, Kansas remains a territory until after the start of the Civil War in 1861, when there are no Southern congressmen left in Congress because of secession. The breakup of the Democratic Party. Buchanan, for evidenced by supporting the Lecompton Constitution, for his support of slavery and pro-slavery actions, including the Constitution, he was opposed for the next election by Northern Democrats. Now remember, the Democrats had been a national party. They had support from both the North and the South. The Whig Party at this point was dead. They really weren't in a position to run any kind of candidate. Those former Whigs ended up supporting primarily the Republican Party. Remember, the new party, the Republican Party, is a sectional party. It's only going to have support in the North because one of its foundations is being against the extension of slavery into the territories. But the idea of the Democratic Party being a national party was one of those last things that kept the United States together, sectional, across sections, North and South. Step back for just a second and talk again about some of the violence that was happening in Kansas and how it spilled over into Washington and the Congress. 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, upset over what they saw as a distortion of a popular sovereignty vote in Kansas and the violence against anti-slavery supporters, delivers a speech on the floor of the Senate, The Crime Against Kansas. In the process of decrying the violence against those that oppose slavery, he also hurled an insult, or what was perceived as an insult, at South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, one of the most popular members of the Senate. His quote was, "South Carolina had sent to the Senate a Don Quixote who had chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery." Now, Southerners were fairly incensed at not only the insult against those in Kansas, but particularly against the South Carolina senator. Some wanted to challenge Sumner to a duel, which they knew he would be likely to refuse. But remember, dueling was fairly common, a common way to settle disagreements during this time. But then they also speculated that dueling was for social equals, and Sumner clearly had shown that he was not a social equal. It was more appropriate for him to get a whipping or a caning. Now, it so happens that the South Carolina senator was not in the Senate the next day, but it just so happens that his cousin, Preston Brooks, who was a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina, took action or took retribution for him, and he attacks Sumner on the Senate floor. He beats him with a heavy cane on the Senate floor, hits him at least 30 times. Sumner is knocked unconscious. Unfortunately for Mr. Sumner, he had to leave the Senate. He was out for about 3.5 years, traveled to Europe for treatment, but to his credit, he did eventually make it back to the Senate, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But clearly you can see this was evidence, actually within the Congress, of the division that clearly took place between the North and the South. Here you can see a political cartoon. You can guess that this is a cartoon produced in the North, jokingly describing Southern chivalry by the caning of Charles Sumner. You can see some folks in the background thought this was very humorous. Some folks in the background did not. Another political cartoon. The quote at the top says, "The symbol of the North is the pen, the symbol of the South is the bludgeon." But again, a very physical example of the level to which the disagreement and the divisions had arisen in Congress, to the point where you have violence on the Senate floor. Here's Mr. Sumner. So the South, as you can imagine, reacted in general with enthusiastic support of Brooks. The Southerners, as a show of support, sent canes to Brooks, some inscribed with the words, "Hit him again." Brooks did decide to resign, but he was very quickly in the next election reelected to his same position in South Carolina. The North kind of used this as a rallying cry as well, passing around copies of Sumner's speech and attacking the bullying or the process of bullying taking place by those in the South. So what is the importance of the caning? And I'll mention this again. It showed that we were to the point where reason and discussion really couldn't take place from either side. This was being replaced by radical speeches trying to stir things up, and ultimately, in the end, physical violence. The punishment from Congress against Mr. Brooks for his actions was a $300 fine. Regions and sections. Up until this point, by and large, other issues had disguised or at least covered over some of the regional differences between the regions, the North and the South. Cultural and material differences kind of reinforced those differences. New England and the Middle States were certainly much more similar to each other and increasingly different from what we've known as the South, the coastal and the Southern Highlands. And the effect is these regions combined into sections, North and South. Earlier, prior to this time, we use labels today like North and South fairly frequently, and we understand what that means. Prior to this time, these terms weren't really used. They weren't described as distinct sections. But now, clearly, these are being more intentionally lumped together. Some other differences here, and we've talked about these before. Immigration was very sectional. Most of the immigrants, and again we're talking mostly Irish and German, but certainly some others sprinkled in. 7/8 of these immigrants came to the North because that's where the job opportunities would be. Maybe low-paying jobs, but that's better than going to the South, where there was free labor for employers, and that certainly wasn't going to be a place that they would go. 94% of the population in the North was literate, at least a basic level of literacy. In the South, only 54% of the population. And remember, for slaves, for blacks, it was generally against the law for them to receive an education. 72% of the children in the North were in school, only 35% in the South. The northern states were dominant in terms of reform movements. That came coming from the area of New England and certainly the remnants of the Quakers in Pennsylvania and surrounding areas. So let's talk about the election of 1856. The Democrats did not want to nominate Pierce, who, as you remember, wasn't very popular at this time, and they didn't want to touch Stephen Douglas either. Both were too tainted by the actions and activities around the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So they nominate something of an outsider, James Buchanan, a Pennsylvania lawyer. During the time of Kansas-Nebraska, he was an ambassador to London, so he was definitely somewhat both physically and materially removed from the situation. So he would have been he was a safer choice for Democrats. Republicans in 1856, Seward from New York was the most prominent leader, but he didn't want to be nominated because he wasn't sure if the Republicans would have an opportunity to win, and he didn't want to have the nomination if it wasn't much more of a clear-cut opportunity. So the Republicans go with Captain John Fremont, he of the Mexican-American War, a hero in California. Again, oftentimes you'll see a political party go for a military hero without much political experience because they think that might be a good way to get votes. As we mentioned, Fremont had no political experience. He wasn't involved, just like Buchanan wasn't involved, and didn't have anything from the Kansas-Nebraska Act attached to him. 1856, we also have a third party participating, the Know Nothing Party, and we've talked about them before. They take on probably the more proper name, of the American Party as well. And again, the basis of the Know Nothing Party is against immigration, and specifically against the German and Irish immigration that was happening. Again, a nativist party saying that America should be for Americans and Americans should be in control. Their nominee is Millard Fillmore, the former president. At this point, there are some former Whigs that support the American Party. And really, again, with third parties, they don't often, well, they rarely, if ever, win, but they certainly might have an impact on the two other parties. And in this case, it threatens to take away votes from Republicans in the Republicans' first national election. The campaign of 1856, Democrats certainly still supporting popular sovereignty in all the territories. The Republicans oppose any extension of slavery into the territories. And remember, this is the basis of the Republican Party. So outside of that, as normally happens, it turns into a campaign of character attacks. Complaints as silly as Buchanan being a bachelor and complaining that Fremont was born illegitimate. So again, clearly you can see substantive campaigning happening in 1856. Buchanan wins the election, but significantly with less than a majority of the popular vote. In the Electoral College, 174 to 114, Fillmore pulls away 8 electoral votes. The popular vote, 1.8 million for Buchanan, 1.3 million for Fremont, and you can see Fillmore did pull votes away and took 870,000. So how might it have been different if the American Party or Know Nothing Party had not participated? Here you can see Democratic support primarily in the South, but you do still have some of those Midwestern states, Indiana, Illinois, still voting Democratic. California voting Democratic as well. The Republican wins in the Northeast and in some of those northern Midwestern states. So why did the Republicans lose in their first national election? Well, the opposition, Buchanan, was something of an omnibus candidate. He had the ability to appeal to voters in the South with his strong ties to the South, and certainly in the North as well. And there were some lingering questions about Fremont, both his experience and his honesty and his ability to use sound judgment were he to be elected. There were also threats from the South, some more outspoken than others, by these aggressive, extreme, pro-slavery Southerners, fire eaters as we've called them before, that they would secede from the Union if a Republican was elected. That's sort of a preview of what might happen later. And it turns out that some in the North did vote for Buchanan for this very reason, in order to eliminate the possibility of secession. And remember, one of the main objectives for people at this point is to keep the Union together. So people were likely to change their vote or change the candidate that they vote for based on this proposition. It's fortunate at this point that secession didn't happen in 1856, because it probably would have happened had Fremont won, because Fremont in the end is certainly not the leader that Abraham Lincoln turned out to be. And in 1856, I think the North was probably more willing to let the South go, to let them secede, than they were in 1860. And the events that we know in retrospect that happened between 1856 and 1860 really arouse Northern angst against the South and make them much more willing to fight at that point. So it's into this toxic soup of Kansas, Nebraska, canings on the floor of the Senate, elections that are turned upon whether or not a state might secede, that we have the Dred Scott bombshell, perhaps the most outrageous Supreme Court case ever decided. The Dred Scott decision comes down just 2 days after Buchanan is sworn into office, so he clearly doesn't have much of a honeymoon period. And basically the case was simple. Dred Scott was a black slave. He lived with his master for 5 years in the free state of Illinois and in the free territory of Wisconsin. Pushed by abolitionists based on his residence, he sued for his freedom based on the fact that he'd lived on this free soil for a number of years. Now, the Supreme Court proceeded to take what should have been a very simple case and turn it into a very complex political issue. First, it ruled, not surprisingly, that Dred Scott was a slave, and that as a slave, he was not a citizen. Therefore, he couldn't sue in federal court, or he didn't have the standing to sue in federal court. Now, the court could have thrown out the case based just on these technical grounds alone, but they decided to go further. Chief Justice Taney, ironically or interestingly from the slave state of Maryland, they ruled that a slave was private property, and that as private property, he or she could be taken to any territory, slave state or free state, and be held there in slavery. The reasoning of the court is that the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution bars Congress from depriving anyone of their property, in this case slaves, without due process of law. And the court goes even further. The court rules that the 1820 Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional, even though it had already been repealed by Kansas, Nebraska, remember, because Congress had no power to ban or bar slavery in the territories, even regardless of what the territorial legislatures wanted to do. An impact of the decision is that free blacks were not citizens of the United States, even if they were citizens of their own states. And Dred Scott and all blacks had no rights then to sue for their rights. So in essence, the Supreme Court in Dred Scott upholds the institution of slavery. So what's the reaction to Dred Scott? Well, clearly you can imagine the South is extremely happy with the decision. It opens up huge land area to slavery, so the possibilities at this point are significant. Democrats in the North, even those, especially those who favored popular sovereignty, were opposed to the Supreme Court. Can call this judicial activism, stepping in and throwing a roadblock to the popular will of the people. Another wedge driven between Northern and Southern Democrats, so separating what had been the National Party into Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, again based on the view of slavery. Now clearly Republicans would have been opposed to the Dred Scott decision as well. Majority of Southerners on the Supreme Court. They dominated the Supreme Court, and injecting itself into politics angered Republicans. The South saw the Union as questionable if one section of the country, that being the North, would not obey a Supreme Court decision. So again, a bit of irony coming from the South. Head down a different path here briefly. Talk about another financial crisis. Remember, we had one in 1837 after the National Bank goes away. We've also got one in 1857, panic and depression. Not quite as bad as 1837, but psychologically, given everything else that had happened in the country up to this point in the 1800s, this is pretty devastating to the country. What are the causes? Well, inflation, because we've got all this California gold coming into the economy. We've got overproduction of grain and over-speculation in land and railroads. So people overextending themselves in the purchase of land and also in investment in the railroads. What's the effect of the Depression of 1857? Well, 5,000 businesses fail. Unemployment is widespread. People are going hungry. The agricultural sector in the North is the hardest hit. In the South, it's not too badly affected because cotton prices remain high based on foreign markets buying a lot of cotton. This kind of gave the South maybe a false sense of security, that they might be stronger economically than they really were, maybe leading to a greater likelihood that the South would be willing to take that step and fight the North. So again, in a downturned economy, the South comes out sitting fairly pretty based on the strong economy, but again, that's just tied to a single crop. So the Depression of 1857 leads to two key Republican issues in the election of 1860. One is a call for free farms, for the federal government, instead of selling some of the land in the West, to give free farms, 160 acres, to individuals. And also a call, again, for higher tariffs to protect U.S. businesses, to build up the local manufacturing. Going to go pretty quickly here through the description here of the free farms and who supported and who opposed. I'll leave this to you guys to read in a little more detail. This is vetoed by Buchanan, certainly because he's going to be generally favoring policies that support the South. Surplus in the Treasury in 1857. The tariff is enacted, which lowers the rates to 20%, the lowest since the War of 1812. The Depression hits, the surplus disappears. Okay, so another factor that leads into the Depression of 1857. Northern manufacturers blame not just the California gold and the like, but also the lowered tariff, not enough money coming in, not enough protection for northern businesses. (1858), we have a new player on the stage, quite literally. We have Abraham Lincoln challenging the senior senator from Illinois, Senator Stephen Douglas, the Democrat. Lincoln, you probably know some of this already, a very tall guy, 180 pounds, born in Kentucky, only attended a formal school for a year. Most of his education was self-taught, a lot of reading. Considered a frontier guy, splitting logs for fences, liked to wrestle, very strong sense of humor, and he's known even when he's in the White House in the dark times of the Civil War for his sense of humor, but he also had fits of depression or melancholy. He married Mary Todd, who in the social structure was above his social status. There's Mary Todd. Lincoln's father's side descends from English Puritans combined with Quakers. They migrated to Appalachia. Again, he was born in Kentucky and later goes to Illinois. So if you break down the supporters of the Republican Party, every component of the regional coalition is represented in Lincoln's background. So you can see how he might appeal to Republicans. Lincoln becomes professionally a trial lawyer in Illinois. He's very well respected and recognized as Honest Abe because he doesn't take cases that he knows are wrong and that he can't believe his defendant. He serves in Congress one term, 1847, 1849, so in the House of Representatives, because that's a two-year term. The controversy over the Kansas-Nebraska Act brings out his leadership abilities. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln becomes the Republican nominee for for Illinois, that currently occupied by Stephen Douglas. And Lincoln agrees to challenge Douglas to a series of 7 debates from August to October leading up to the election of 1858. Can you imagine in modern times any candidate, whether they're a sitting or a challenger, that would agree to have 7 debates with his opponent? Now, Douglas was a very experienced, polished speaker with a powerful voice. We've talked about him before and some of the powerful speeches that he's made in the Senate. Lincoln, not so much, at least at this point, a high voice. He didn't like necessarily speaking in public, but he was good at logic, very good at arguing, and his technique wasn't the greatest, but he was nonetheless very effective. The most famous of these series of 7 debates is in Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln asked Douglas what would happen if people voted down slavery in a territory. Now, the Supreme Court had said in Dred Scott that slavery couldn't be restricted in the territory. Then who would win, the people or the Supreme Court? Here's an image from the debates, commemorated in plaques. And out of this question that Lincoln poses to Douglas, we have something called the Freeport Doctrine. And this is basically coming out of Douglas' response to the question. So even though the Supreme Court said slavery was open in the territories, slavery for all practical matters wouldn't move into the territories if people didn't want it to be there, if it wasn't going to be profitable to be there. But you would have to have laws protecting slavery. But that wouldn't happen if people didn't approve of them. So again, if individuals had chosen not to have slaves in a territory because it didn't make sense, then laws protecting slavery wouldn't happen. Now, history supported this idea. When people didn't support the federal government, the unpopular law became almost impossible to enforce. One contemporary example of that would be the Fugitive Slave Act in the North, right? And here's Douglas's specific quote. I answer emphatically, in my opinion, the people of a territory can, by lawful means, exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution. It matters not what the Supreme Court may hereafter decide, as to the abstract question, whether slavery may or may not go into a territory under the Constitution. The people have the lawful means to introduce it or exclude it as they please. For the reason that slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations. Those police regulations can only be established by the local legislature. And if the people are opposed to slavery, they will elect representatives to that body who will effectually prevent the introduction of it into their midst. If, on the contrary, they're for it, their legislation will favor its extension. Hence, no matter what the decision of the Supreme Court may be on that abstract question, still, the right of the people to make a slave territory or a free territory is perfect and complete under his Nebraska bill. So at this point, I'll refer you to the primary documents that we've read on the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So in the senatorial election, 1858 in Illinois, Stephen Douglas wins. Basically because of the popularity of the idea of popular sovereignty at this point. And even though he doesn't win the election, Lincoln does win something of a moral victory. It certainly thrusts him into the national spotlight. It's important to mention at this point as well that United States senators at this point were not elected by the people. They were elected by state legislators. And Douglas had more pro-Douglas legislators in the Illinois State Assembly than pro-Lincoln legislators. So it was going to be pretty clear that Douglas was going to win, but again, definitely some impression is made by Lincoln. Again, Lincoln is now in the national spotlight, and he's seen as a pretty strong voice spokesperson for the Republican Party. And remember, Douglas had hurt his chances of winning the presidency because he wasn't going to get any support in the South as a Democrat because he opposed the Lecompton Constitution. And he was certainly defying the impact of the Dred Scott decision. All right, which brings us to our friend that we've read about, John Brown. Was he a murderer or was he a martyr? Now, he's already famous, as we've talked about, for the attacks at Pottawatomie, where he and his followers murder 5 pro-slavery activist. Well, he has a new plan. Invade the South with his fellow followers, figure out a way to put guns and the like in the hands of escaped slaves, and establish a black state for ex-slaves. Some images of Mr. Brown, obviously earlier in his life in the first, the second closer to the time of Harper's Creek, or Harper's Ferry. So what was his plan? Well, he got some support from abolitionists in the North, several $1,000s to buy guns. In October of 1859, he and 20 of his followers march into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is the site of a federal arsenal, which is a place where they keep weapons. And as part of his plan, they kill 7 people, including unintentionally a free black. But the idea is that slaves would leave their plantations, leave their masters, and come together. They would be armed with the guns that were in the armory. But it doesn't happen. Slaves fail to join. Most slaves don't even hear about it or know about it, in part because they didn't even know what his plan was. Very quickly, his band is captured and imprisoned, interestingly again by U.S. Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee. Remember that name for a little bit later. So Brown is captured and eventually convicted of murder and treason. 17 of his friends tried to, in testimony, claim that he was insane to get him off, and we read about this again in the article that we read over the Thanksgiving Day break. The judge disagreed with that, but he did spend several months in prison, was a martyr both during this time, but certainly after his death as well, for the abolitionist cause. He ends up being hanged, but his legend, his fame continue. Some images from the failed attack at Harper's Ferry. Famous image, a painting of John Brown on the way to his execution, kissing a slave baby. This may or may not have happened, but this was based on a newspaper article from a New York newspaper that this did happen, and certainly could be seen as something of propaganda to increase his martyrdom in the North. So how do they feel about John Brown in the South? Well, clearly they saw him as a murderer and treasonous. They blamed abolitionists in the North again for stirring things up. They frankly believed that everyone in the North was an abolitionist, and that it was the fault of these folks coming down here to the South and stirring things up. At this point, the South felt as though, how could they possibly stay in this union if the North is going to keep sending down these crazy people who are going to, create mayhem and be murdering abolitionists? In the North, there were certainly a significant number of abolitionists and free soilers who were angry that Brown was executed. They didn't necessarily know about his violent past or his previous issues, or that his overall bigger plan was to invade the South. And many believe that even if the ends didn't justify the means, that Brown, because he did have a righteous cause, one that many in the North supported at this point, that he should not have been killed. So in the North, on the day that Brown was executed, there was public support shown, church bells tolled, guns were fired, abolitionist rallies were held, and even the famous transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson compared Brown to Jesus. Getting closer to the election of 1860. Now, the election of 1860, Democrats are divided. They meet in South Carolina. They talk for a while. Can't decide how to deal with the issue of slavery, both in candidate and in terms of the platform. Clearly, the leader of the Democrats would have been Stephen Douglas. But those in the South, those fire eaters in the South, because of Freeport, because of his opposition to the Lecompton Constitution, couldn't stand Douglas. So in the end, the convention in South Carolina breaks up because Southern Democrats walk out. So if you want to pinpoint a time where the Democratic Party splits from being a national party, it would probably be the failure of this first convention in 1860 in Charleston, South Carolina. They get together again in Baltimore a short time after, and this time Douglas supporters are the ones that are in control. Southerners again walk out, and after the Southerners walk out, Stephen Douglas is nominated. The platform at this point is those things championed by Stephen Douglas: popular sovereignty, and to try to appease to some in the South, calling on the North to enforce the fugitive slave law. But that's not it. Remember, the Democratic Party is splitting up. So they meet, the Southern Democrats meet again a little bit after the Northern Democrats. They meet in Baltimore, and they nominate John Breckinridge from Kentucky, something of a moderate, but again, coming from Kentucky, which was at that point a slave state. The platform of the Southern Democrats: extension of slavery into the territories, certainly championing Dred Scott, and if possible, the annexation of Cuba as a slave state, again, looking to extend slavery down to the South. So we have two Democratic parties, a Northern Democratic Party, a Southern Democrat Party. Into this we have another new party, this one called the Constitution Union Party. This group's made up of the few Southern Whigs that are left, but also the Know-Nothings, which don't have a party or a nominee of their own at this point. And they nominate a true dark horse, an unknown, John Bell of Tennessee. And as the name implies, the main platform plank for the Constitution Union Party is to preserve the Union and enforce the law as it stands today, which would include support for the institution of slavery. So we have two Democratic parties, the Constitution Union Party, and we will also have a Republican Party. Now, the leader of the Republicans at this point would still be Senator William Seward, but Seward had been a very outspoken abolitionist and had many enemies as a result of that. As recently as 1858, he had spoken of the conflict between slavery and freedom as being an irrepressible conflict. So what do the Republicans do? They nominate Abraham Lincoln. A new face, certainly hadn't done enough that would generate a lot of animosity or enemies from anyone, so Lincoln becomes the Republican candidate. So what's the platform for the Republican Party in the election of 1860? Well, it basically has something for every non-Southern group. Free Soilers, the non-extension of slavery into the territories. For Northern manufacturers, a significant protective tariff. For immigrants, protection of their rights as new arrivals in the country. For the Northwest, a Pacific Railroad through the Northwest portion of the country. For the West, some internal improvements that would be paid for and supported by the federal government. And for those looking for territory or for land in the West, free homesteads. So everything that someone in the North might want to support was part of the Republican platform. Now, there were those in the South, just as they threatened in 1856, that said any election of Lincoln and the platform of the Republican Party would likely split the Union, that the states, several of the states would secede. And it's important to mention, and we'll talk about the evolving opinion of Abraham Lincoln towards slavery, but at this point, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He did oppose the extension of slavery into the territories, but he was not advocating for the end of slavery at this point. The campaign between Douglas and Lincoln was intense, and between their supporters as well. Douglas campaigned, even though it wasn't likely that he was going to get much support down there, he did campaign in the South. Or if you think about it, John Bell and Breckinridge had been chosen instead of him as a candidate to represent the South. Political cartoon relative to the election. You can see each candidate represented here, all relative to the decision in Dred Scott. Now, the election of 1860 is perhaps the most, certainly one of the most interesting, but perhaps the most unique in American history. Now, obviously, in a national election, which this was, the candidate that gets the most votes in the Electoral College will be president. But if you break it down, this basically was a contest between the North and the South. So in the North, you had Lincoln competing for votes with Stephen Douglas. In the South, you had Breckinridge appealing for votes against Bell. Whichever of these four could gain the most in their region was going to be the one that won the election. So Abraham Lincoln wins the election as a minority and sectional president. We'll talk about what that means here in a bit. If you look at the popular vote, Lincoln was opposed by more than 60% of the voters. The only electoral votes that Lincoln gained were in the North. In the 10 southern states, Lincoln didn't receive one popular vote. And as a matter of fact, in many of the states in the South, Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot. So imagine that. Stephen Douglas actually did better than expected, even though he only won 12 electoral votes. He was a close second in popular votes. And Douglas was a fierce campaigner. He campaigned very aggressively, which really wasn't the norm at the time. And usually the candidates would let those that supported them do the campaigning for them. And perhaps it was just as a statesman. He knew that Lincoln sort of had the momentum and was going to win. But some would argue that he campaigned in the South in order to attempt to keep the Union together. There is a myth out there. Some people would say if the Democrats had stayed united between North and South, they would have beaten Lincoln. Douglas and Breckinridge's votes together would have put the Democratic candidate ahead of Lincoln. But Lincoln still would have won the electoral vote, 169 to 134, instead of what the actual result was, 180 to 123. Lincoln had votes from the more populous North and states in the Northwest. And here's the map. So you'll see very clearly no northern or no southern states voted for Abraham Lincoln. Bell gets a little support there in the middle, but the Southern Democrat Breckinridge gets the support of the South. Lincoln wins the North, the Midwest, and the two western states as well. If you think about it, the vote in the South didn't necessarily support the idea of secession because the Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, he was the candidate of these folks, these extreme pro-slavery fire eaters, but Breckinridge himself didn't support disunion. So if he had been elected, he would not have supported the breaking up of the Union. And Breckinridge actually did worse in the South than the combined numbers of Douglas and Bell. So how bad were things in the South after the election of Abraham Lincoln? Well, the South still had a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court with Justice Taney as the Chief Justice. The Republicans didn't control either of the houses of Congress, the House of Representatives or the Senate. It was very unlikely that slavery would be impacted or overturned in the 15 slave states unless there was a constitutional amendment, and that was unlikely to happen since only a quarter of the states could block an amendment. The slave states outnumbered, the slave states were just under half at this point. So there really wasn't much that the North would be able to do so long as the South stayed together. Regardless, not surprisingly, South Carolina leads the exodus. Just 4 days after Lincoln's election is confirmed, South Carolina gets together, has a special state convention. And in December of 1860, they vote unanimously to secede from the Union. Over the next 6 weeks, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow the lead of South Carolina. You can see the result here of the state conventions and how they voted for secession. The blue, those that voted for secession, very few voting against secession. Refer now to your primary document on South Carolina's Declaration of Secession. A couple of political cartoons. The first, the secession movement. I'll let you guess first which viewpoint this represents. You can see various men riding these animals, mules, pigs, and the like, carrying the flags of South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and it looks like they're about to run over the cliff. So you can imagine which viewpoint this would represent. Likewise, here you have a cat who's labeled as Uncle Abe. Looks like a rat on his back with a flag saying the Union must and shall be preserved, and several small rats or mice running away. Interesting to think about. The Second Continental Congress, going back to the time of the Revolution, deliberated 14 months before it declared its independence with the Declaration of Independence. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 took almost 2 years to put a new government in place by the time the Constitution was ratified by the states. So it's amazing that the Confederate States of America organized itself, drafted a constitution, set up a headquarters, a capital in Montgomery, Alabama, all in 90 days. In February of 1861, the 7 states meet and form the Confederate States of America. They elect as their first and only president a former senator from Mississippi, and this is before secession, Jefferson Davis. Now remember, Lincoln is elected in November, but he doesn't take office until March 4th. So in that lame duck time, or that interim, James Buchanan is the president. There's nothing that Lincoln could do at this time. President Buchanan was opposed to secession, but he was pretty passive, pretty conservative in nature, and he couldn't find any legal justification to force the states to stay in the Union. The Union didn't really have a very strong military at this point that they could send troops into the South. They needed to have these troops to control Indian uprisings in the West, so there really weren't troops to send into the South at this point. And frankly, at this point, public opinion in the North didn't support force. They hoped that there were other means, perhaps negotiation, would bring the southern states back into the Union. We do at this late point in 1860 have one last attempt at compromise, unfortunately not successful. These are called the Crittenden Amendments, proposed by Kentucky Senator John Crittenden. Certainly things in Kentucky still named after the late senator. And what the Crittenden Amendments would do is give federal protection for slavery in territories south of 3630, but prohibit slavery north of that time. So again, federal protection for slavery in territories south of 3630, but prohibit it north of that line. Now, territories north or south of that line, when they come into the Union, they can come in with or without slavery as they choose, as they vote for. The South might hope that, time with slavery in these territories might make it more permanent to slavery going forward. So that's the proposal. Here's what it looks like on the map. Here's your 3630 line. So what's the reaction to the Crittenden Compromise? Lincoln rejects it. He had some hope of success, but all hope of compromise ended. Lincoln had been elected on the platform, the basis of the Republican Party, of not extending slavery into these territories. And the fear was that, with this kind of a compromise, it means that the South, every time there was an opportunity, they would push for war against any country south of 3630 in order to gain more possible territory for slavery. So think about Cuba, think about Mexico, think about countries in Central and South America. Because those are below 3630, the South would push for that. So it didn't seem like a very workable solution, and as a result, it was not successful. So what justification? So it's probably a good thing that Buchanan didn't use force against the South to bring them back into the Union. Would have made things worse for the North. The North would have appeared to be the aggressor. And it's very likely, and probably most important, that the North would have lost the 3 border states that ended up staying with the Union, these border slave states that ended up staying in the Union throughout the Civil War. And we'll explore that much more in the next unit. Sort of as a side note, it's important to note, or it's interesting to note, that Congress passed a first version of what would be the 13th Amendment in February of 1861. You might call this something of a compromise as well, even after Crittenden, that guaranteed slavery in all the states against any future interference by the federal government. So it's interesting to note that coming out of Congress, we did have a constitutional amendment passed. Now, it never was ratified by the states, but you did have the federal Congress proposing a guarantee of slavery as late as 1861. Again, something of a compromise. This version of the 13th Amendment obviously doesn't make it into the Constitution. We don't have a 13th Amendment until 4 years later, and ironically, it will be the one that abolishes slavery. So what reasons did the South give for secession? Well, they certainly felt that the political balance was tipped against slave states. They were certainly outnumbered now by free states in the Senate. The Republican Party, in their minds, had triumphed. And frankly, they were tired of criticism from abolitionists and free soilers. They didn't want people from the North to interfere. They were tired of the Underground Railroad and the consternation that that caused. And certainly they didn't want murderers like John Brown coming into the South and messing things up. The South didn't believe that the North would fight. They felt, with some justification, they felt that Northern manufacturers and shippers were too dependent on cotton from the South, because remember, a lot of the factories in the Northeast were textile factories. The South also felt that they could repudiate large debts that they'd borrowed from Northern creditors. So they could just basically renege on the loans that they'd received from the North, and they felt that the North wouldn't do anything to jeopardize those debts from the South. Some also looked at this as an opportunity for the South to develop its own systems, its own banking and industry, much like the North had done. It could trade directly with Europe and not have to worry about pro-North tariffs, protective tariffs. So rather than look at this as an issue or a problem, some in the South actually looked at it as an opportunity. You'll remember around this time from our discussions in world history last year, this idea of nationalism is spreading around the world, and these feelings certainly are spreading to the South. The South sees itself now as a separate nation, more than part of a bigger nation. They believe that they had the right to determine their own future. They didn't see anything wrong with secession. They wanted to blaze their own trails. In the beginning, 13 states had entered the Union voluntarily, and now 7 were voluntarily leaving. 13 colonies had thrown off the oppression of King George, and now the South was simply throwing off the oppression of, in their mind, King Abraham. So they didn't see it as so dissimilar from what had happened in 1776. Lincoln, as you can imagine, had a very different opinion. He thought that it was anarchy if the minority felt that they could just leave rather than acquiesce or agree with, go along with the will of the majority of the states. In his mind, the union of the states was perpetual, and states didn't have the right to secede. It's the people, not the states, that form the union. This ends this unit. Obviously, we have secession, we have Lincoln as president, and we will follow what happens next, the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter, in the next unit.